Okay, I lost the joke. Go ahead.
Here's a joke.
Oh my gosh. Starting strong.
The sound's not on, so it doesn't really work quite as well.
Yeah, I can't believe you already stole my bit.
Oh no!
Because I was gonna hold up
All
my
right.
$700 O's driver.
Welcome everyone to another episode of the Stray Pixels podcast, where as of this week we have successfully eliminated all of the men from the podcast. Technically speaking.
Yay!
Technically.
I am your host, Noisy Pixel staff writer Colin Buchanan, and I am joined by my fellow staff writer Nathan Mejia. And if you have already noticed, if you are watching the video version of this podcast, we have a new co-host. Jacob, do you want to talk about yourself a little bit?
Yeah, I'm Jacob Kavanagh. I go by Pyre on Twitter and stuff at Pyreloop. Wow,
Yes,
I forgot my own Twitter
I will
handle.
have it in the outro. I plug everybody.
I'm really good at this. But yeah, I've been one of the staff writers on Noisy Pixel since forever. I think my official title is senior editor, just to make it fancy because I've been here so long.
Mm-hmm. That means that you're one of Azario's favorite kids, is what that means.
Oh, how sweet. But yeah, I've been here since the site opened, and I've not actually done any facecam stuff before. So this is a first.
Well,
actually, we did the anniversary video bit.
Oh, true.
We did the two of those. But so this is technically my first time inside.
Sure. And it's your first time like being on screen for more than 10 seconds.
Yeah.
More than 10 seconds with that cars in the background.
Which is
there wasn't a car in the background.
Which is obviously, kind of what I started this project for, is to give all the other people that wanted a little bit more exposure to finally have that shot. I'm also going to throw this out up front. So I did already make the joke, but just to clarify for those of you who are listening, my pronouns, Colin's pronouns are he/they, Nate's pronouns are he/they, and Jacob's are they/them exclusively. So please bear that in mind, and we will all have a happy time together. So in order to kind of ease our new co-host into the process so that we could give them the maximum amount of prep time possible, we decided that today we would finally do the third episode of our Stray Memories series on Final Fantasy. And the previous videos were on sets of 3 games. That is mostly because the NES and the Super NES games, while there's plenty to talk about, I don't know that any of us could have filled an entire 40 minutes with any of them. Not the case.
Two of my favorites.
Not the case here, because today we are talking about one of the most influential video games ever created. And that, of course, is Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core.
Hey, it's where Tabata really showed off its writing chops for the first time, I think. So,
Final Fantasy VII, as we kind of discussed in the previous episode, was the first game to be developed in the Polygon 3D era. They wanted to do a lot more with it than the N64 cartridges could have handled. So even though the N64 is actually a more powerful console than the PS1 is, the discs of the PS1 could hold 20 times as much as an N64 cartridge. So once they started looking into things like full motion video and pre-rendered backgrounds, it became really obvious that they needed a bigger storage solution. And so Square and Nintendo broke up. They broke up, and a Final Fantasy game would not appear on a Nintendo or a new Final Fantasy game wouldn't appear on a Nintendo platform until Crystal Chronicles in 2004, I want to say. So it was a good long while. It was a huge gamble. The PS1 was obviously a debut console, even though it was super popular. And this was the biggest game that they had ever made at the time. Apparently, this game's budget was, if you include marketing, around $80 million.
Sweet Jesus.
Which is kind of nuts.
Yeah.
Like,
hi, this is the PlayStation 1.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is 97.
Yep. Game came out January 31st, 1997 in Japan, and then September 7th of that same year in North America, and then came to Europe in November.
I think the PlayStation came out like very like 7 was almost a launch title, wasn't it? For the PlayStation?
I don't remember when the PS1 actually came out. PS1 came out.
PS1 was released in 94 in Japan.
94 in Japan, 95 in North America. So it was a couple years late, but FF7 did start development as a Super Nintendo game. So we do have that. And then obviously the scope was expanded once they realized what they could do with the 3D technology.
Yeah.
Although, that hasn't stopped plenty of people from creating fan games that are kind of expanding on the idea of, hey, what if this was a Super Nintendo game? There's also the moderately famous Chinese NES ripoff of this game that exists. A demake of Final Fantasy VII for the Nintendo Entertainment System exists. You can play it on an NES emulator.
Huh. All right.
It's kind of kooky. It kind of reminds me of playing like Vietnamese Pokemon Crystal or something.
Yeah. So they were, according to this, they were concepting FF7 during the development of Chrono Trigger,
which makes sense.
And then developed their scope as they worked on Chrono Trigger, and that explains about.
That explains a lot, actually, because that way they could hedge some bets with a more traditional game coming out soon too, rather than this big bombastic thing.
Yeah, because no one was really expecting Chrono Trigger to blow up the way that it did. So that worked out great for everybody. Square's basically unbroken complete dominance of the genre everywhere except Japan continued. Obviously, Japan still had Dragon Quest or Dragon Warrior, as we had to call it in the United States for a while.
Quest just isn't hardcore enough.
No, it was a trademark, copyright. It was a trademark trademark issue. Sort of like why Great British Bake Off can't be called that outside of, or in the United States, because Pillsbury has a trademark for the word bake off.
All right.
In America.
Thanks, Pillsbury.
Yep.
So that's so cute when you punch that stomach now, is it?
So Final Fantasy VII was, as I said before, one of the most influential and genre-defining games basically of all time. This was the game that got normies into the idea of playing JRPGs because like it looked so cool, and at the time it looked so good. It certainly doesn't anymore, but at the time we hadn't really seen like an adventure that felt like this realized on the PS1, not to this scope anyway. So released on 3 discs, which is kind of notable because Final Fantasy VIII and 9 both shipped on 4 discs, but the 4th disc was largely just the last part of the game, like the very last dungeon. And obviously it was recently partially remade. We are not going to be discussing Remake in this episode. We're going to save that for its own episode later down the line because it is its own beast. With its own massive amount of stuff to talk about. But going down the list, Nate, what was your first experience with Final Fantasy VII?
My first experience with Final Fantasy VII was probably when I was 8, so I think a year after release. My mom had picked it up and put it away for some reason. I don't know why, but eventually I found myself looking through our old TV. What do you call them? Basically, where you put DVDs and stuff in.
Yeah.
And we had a drawer full of games, and I was looking through that, and I found Final Fantasy VII. I went, huh, this looks kind of cool, because it was the classic case with him looking out to the Mako factory.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I pop it in, I go through, and I get my ass beat because I am 8 years old. And it kind of started a trajectory, though. It definitely popped me into the RPG space, and it never let me go, because after that, my first real game that was mine, my own game, was Pokemon. And those two games together combined to where I almost exclusively played RPGs growing up. Funny to say, Final Fantasy VII is not my favorite Final Fantasy, though. It is my third or fourth favorite.
What's kind of funny is if Bailey were here. Bailey recently experienced Final Fantasy VII for the first time. He played it in its entirety last year, and he hated it. He said it was like a 6 out of 10.
Oh wow!
So
I'm gonna drop the hot take here and say my opinion would be similar, because I also played Final Fantasy VII way too late.
Yeah. Okay, then Jacob, go ahead. Give us your first experience and your hot take.
My first experience with Final Fantasy VII was through Kingdom Hearts.
Okay.
Ooh, that's a very different cloud.
And then, just to make it even spicier, the first proper Final Fantasy VII game I picked up was Dirge of Cerberus.
Oh,
and that
dear.
I played to completion multiple times.
Oh dear. My boyfriend also played Dirge of Cerberus to completion multiple times because he was very limited in what he was able to access, and also he has bad taste in video games.
I mean, it's terrible, but also it was the perfect game for my very edgy preteen self.
I was gonna say this was definitely emo pyre era.
So and because I've always had terrible computers, I essentially did the whole going through Final Fantasy VII backwards, because 7 was the last one I actually played out of it. Mm-hmm. So I'd played Dirge of Cerberus, I'd watched Advent Children, I'd played Crisis Core, all before I got to 7. And 7 wasn't bad by any means. It's incredibly impressive, but also it was the first time I was seeing properly the 3D models on the pre-rendered polygons, and that was just throwing my mind, and it kind of hurts.
The field models with their soccer bopper hands.
Yeah, climbing down a ladder it was like, hang on, where is the ladder? Is that a ladder I can walk down? Is that how this functions? I couldn't pick it out, and it just made things very difficult and eye-strainy for me, for my unable to comprehend self.
So my first experience with FF7 was after playing Kingdom Hearts, playing 8 and 9. I found out, so I played 8 and 9 because my dad had them, and we're going to talk about that experience when we get to those games in the next episode. But I was at a friend's house. We had a whole bunch of family friends in the neighborhood, and these people were relatively well off. And I happened to notice, oh my gosh, this game is on their shelf. I've heard of it so many times. I've never played it myself. And I asked if I could borrow it. And they kind of forgot that I had it, I think. I'm not really sure what went down. But shrug it. So I still have it. I don't really know how or if I should return it. But I played it on my dad's PS2. So the thing about 7, I wasn't poisoned necessarily, because obviously 8 and 9 look miles better, but we weren't in the HD era of gaming, so I was still willing to accept the crazy field character designs and how limited it all was compared to like the wide open level designs that you get in stuff like Kingdom Hearts and the newer Final Fantasy titles. But after replaying it when I was in high school on my PSP, I kind of started to realize that it's definitely aged the worst out of all of the PS1 games, because it was a huge gamble, but it also wasn't much of an experiment in terms of its actual gameplay over the previous games. Like it's effectively the same combat system that FF6 had, just with a more clear limit break system, because FF6 just had the desperation attacks that like did not have a clear method of triggering, as opposed to having
if you're on 1/16th health, you've got a chance of triggering a special move. I played that game multiple times without even knowing desperation attacks were a thing.
Yeah, as opposed to just having a nice little bar that built up as you fought. But so aesthetically and in terms of its setting, it's very different. It very much took the steampunk empire thing that Final Fantasy VI had going on and was just like, hey, what if we just like actually made it the future? So it's a very dystopian capitalist corporate future, and that gets explored a lot more in the compilation and the remake, the like capitalist hellscape of it, where it's very like there's one really prominent element of it in the base game, and that is Shinra killing the planet with its energy demands. But that's kind of all it has that's really different from the three games that preceded it. We saw like a different system for powering up beyond just leveling up, but Final Fantasy VI also had like equipable materia that would give you stat boosts and could ruin your character build if you didn't do it correctly. And at the time, Final Fantasy VII also had a really notably awful localization.
Oh yeah, right.
So, I like this game. I like it a lot. Don't get me wrong. But the huge issues with this game and the way it was originally localized were Barrett is a racist stereotype, and I think that we can all probably agree on that in today's age.
But he was our racist stereotype.
And they improved him. They improved him dramatically in Remake. But at the time, he was the first. He was the first character in a Final Fantasy game to swear, and oh my God, does he swear all the time?
Yeah.
And they had translation issues just out the wazoo. The most famous one being in the very first boss battle of the game, where the game Barrett will tell you when you're fighting Guard Scorpion, attack while the tail's up, beat, beat, beat. It'll counterattack with a laser. So if you don't know that this is coming, while he was saying this first message and the text box hung on screen for like 10 full seconds, you probably queued in all of your attacks, not realizing that the second half of that was it'll counterattack if the tail's up, and then it probably wiped your party or brought you very near to death with 3 consecutive counterattacks.
Barrett's just playing the smart game here. You don't have to pay the mercenary if they've already been killed.
His job is done. He planted the bomb.
Yeah.
It's all about that, making that money, girl.
So my other problematic issue with this game is not really a problem with the game itself, but more of like what I think is the ideal way to have experienced Final Fantasy VII, all the compilation games, and the remake is to have played 7 like 15 years ago. And that's not a helpful answer for how to approach these games, but it is my honest answer, because all the rest of this stuff, it really helps if you have rose-colored glasses on. It really, really does.
It does. I think another way to counter this kind of thing is it's also not very helpful, but try your best to play on as close to the settings we would have done, barring getting a crappy CRT TV, all that stuff. But I would say it helps dramatically when I played a game for the first time via emulator on PC or the PC version versus playing it on PlayStation for the first time. Regarding, can't remember what game it was now, but it was a game I vehemently hated when I played upscale on an emulator, but when I played back down on a PlayStation or SNES, I kind of liked it better because I was being able to go back and kind of transport myself back by using the physical hardware. And I think there's a lot to that. It's not going to fix everybody's problem with it because people are still going to go unga bunga graphic bad, unga bunga.
Hey, remember there are lots of emulators out there that allow to add scan lines in to really get that effect, that as close as you can to that CRT effect without actually having a CRT.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Just slap the disc in and call it a day.
So fun facts about Final Fantasy VII. Final Fantasy VII was the first game, I believe the first game in general, to have character design done by Tetsuya Nomura. If I recall correctly, I believe that Yoshitaka Amano, who very famously did the character design for the first 6 games, I believe they did have him do artwork for this game, but it was eventually decided that once they wanted to go in a more modern art direction, they brought in Nomura to kind of take the designs that already existed and tweak them to make them like a little bit more what we viewed as the future at the time. But also like a little bit more.
Actually do character designs in 6, but it was specifically just Shadow and Setzer.
Yeah.
Okay.
And this is where he had the full sort of
sure.
Well, he did everyone in 7.
Yeah, and then him and Sakaguchi also wrote the story. Which was the first game that I believe he did story work on.
Yes.
So for everybody concerned about Remake going Kingdom Hearts bullshit, that all started here. He wrote the original. He gets to do what he wants with it.
Which is funny because Final Fantasy VII has some Kingdom Hearts bullshit in it.
Yes.
Like it's very minimal because of Sakaguchi's influence, but it's still there.
You mean the previous Final Fantasy games don't have their own levels of bullshit in them? Like, a world fuses with another one?
So I would say that the actual like Tetsuya Nomura bullshit thing started in earnest here, specifically with the point near the end of the game where you go into Cloud's subconscious, because like we'd not seen a huge twist like this happen before.
Yeah.
So for those for those at home that have no idea what I'm talking about, so Cloud is the protagonist, obviously, and for the entire game, it appears that his memories of himself don't match up with people that knew him, but do match up with someone else that everybody keeps saying that he reminds them of. And it turns out that it is because he very recently, to the beginning of the game, experienced a really traumatic event, and the way that his brain coped with it was by subsuming another person's identity into his own. So he just genuinely believed himself to be an entirely different person, just with the same name and appearance.
And it's not even that same person. It's his perspective on that person.
Yes.
To make it even tastier.
And we will get into that in the second half of the episode, but effectively Tifa, who is his childhood friend, has to basically like delve into his brain and sort of fix everything that's incorrect in his mind. It's very strange.
Also kind of toxic once you start thinking about it.
It's Osmosis Jones therapy. And it's a very trippy sequence to play through. It's a very like visceral Danganronpa-y twist. And obviously Danganronpa didn't exist at the time, but like it's very much like that's the kind of thing that would happen in one of these games where like the whole thing is building to some kind of massive mind fucking twist.
It's my favorite part of this whole thing is like my favorite part of Final Fantasy VII.
Is really, the subconscious?
It's the subconscious and everything to do with Cloud and the Nibelheim.
Oh, sure. Yeah. And 7 also introduced obviously Sephiroth, who to this day is the most famous villain in the entire franchise. Mm-hmm. And it's gotten to the point where even villains that they're doing today are still kind of trying to ape off of his vibe. And I'm talking about characters that I still like, but like I'm talking about like Arden from Final Fantasy 15 is clearly meant to be very Sephiroth-y.
He doesn't really feel like that.
I was gonna say the other big one is Xenos from 14.
Oh,
I haven't played 14.
Yeah. No, I see what you mean. But basically, both those characters have like a weird, especially Xenos has a weird love with the protagonist.
Like both of these games feature villains that are really obsessed with their protagonists due to like some kind of backstory connection with them. In the case of Sephiroth, it's a recent backstory. In the case of Noctis, it's like 50 years ago. No, it's much further than that. And then in the case of Xenos, by the end, it's millennia ago. But the outreach of this game, because it's so iconic to the series, is very obviously felt. And that really showed when Square Enix's big tech demo for the PlayStation 3 was a remake of this game's opening sequence, just the opening movie. And this started an absolute firestorm for years of people being like, wait, is there going to be a remake? Are we making a remake? When's the remake happening, Square? Because like they were so desperate. And the game wasn't even like that old at that point. Everybody just got this taste. And it just ignited the fandom because people love Final Fantasy VII just that much.
And we are talking about that was a PS3 tech demo.
Yes.
Yep.
So there's already been a huge graphical leap. I mean, the PS2 had titles like Final Fantasy X, 2, and 12 for visual capabilities.
Yeah.
So even if it wasn't that old, there's a huge jump. And imagine FF7 with the development of 12. Well, if you could just forget the remake exists for a moment, just push that aside.
Sure. Sorry, train of thought was going and then it just boom.
Yeah.
So 7 got re-released before it got remade a bunch of times, basically in the interim, which pissed even more people off because they were like, no, we want a remake. We don't just want the PS1 game. It came out on PS3. The original version of the game came out as a PS1 classic, and then you had the PC version be re-released. This game initially came out on PC. The port was developed by Eidos before Square actually owned them. And is graphically better than the PS1 version, but has MIDI music. So, but I feel like the PC version of FF7 is really famous as like a stereotype for a game that people torrented based on YouTube tutorials. back in the early days of YouTube, I have such distinct memories of like opening up a YouTube video and it would be like a guy doing screen recording with a pirated recording software, and they'd be on Notepad, and you'd hear every, "Hey guys, here's how to download Final Fantasy VII on your computer for free," and it would just be a tutorial on how to torrent stuff.
Yeah.
And then it did eventually make its way to a Nintendo platform much later, 20 years later. It's on the Switch as the enhanced version, and then that version also came to PS4 and Xbox One.
Yep.
It's not quite to the degree that we would get like the HD texture remakes that a lot of fans have created for the PC versions, some of which are like uncanny valley because you still have to make it fit in the engine.
Yeah.
But like the amount of fan dedication to 7 is matched by very few other games that exist, not just in this franchise, that exist. So before we move on, Jacob, do you have any closing thoughts on Final Fantasy VII just in and of itself?
I really don't. You've already covered basically all your major pointers.
Sure. Nate, how about you?
I would say Final Fantasy VII is a game. The original is a game you have to take with a grain of salt and try your best to think about yourself being a kid on an older system rather than taking it to our today's standards, because by today's standards, 7 is very lacking. But there's a reason why people love it so much, and people wanted this remake, was to eliminate that barrier of entry, which ironically the remake carries even more of a barrier of entry.
Yeah. I think it's kind of funny how 7 has kind of subsumed signature elements of previous games in the series that like people don't really think about, because everyone just thinks about, you know, Aerith dying in 7, and nobody remembers that Galuf died in 5 and Leo died in 6. Everybody's like, oh my god, this was the first like big video game death story. And I think that it spoke to people. Like, I think that actually seeing, you know, people that looked closer to real than we'd ever had before in the pixel era kind of set a tone for Final Fantasy for a good long while. This was the moment that I think Square first really started to embrace cutting edge technology, really, because the next 2 games would only look even better. And nowadays, like, Final Fantasy as a franchise is known for like pushing graphical boundaries in terms of its realism and art style, and that definitely started here. So I think that even though a lot of elements of this game were a risk and a lot of them played it very safe, I think that it's well loved for a good reason. And I think that, you know, these characters are iconic for a reason and deservedly got expanded upon in everything that was to come, which is what we're going to talk about after we take a quick break. Welcome back, everybody. So in the first half of this episode, we tried to, as much as possible, just talk about Final Fantasy VII in and of itself. But the really notable thing about Final Fantasy VII compared to most of the other games in the franchise is that it has an expanded universe, and one that I honestly think a lot of people potentially like even more than the base game, although I'm talking mostly about one very specific property. But so Final Fantasy VII, several years after it initially launched, basically spawned a project called the Compilation of Final Fantasy VII, a title which makes no sense because it's really just the series, like just all the spin-off games that came out of it. But we got Crisis Core, which was a game on the PSP that utilized a modified version of the engine from Final Fantasy X-2, adapted for action RPG combat, starring Zack Fair, the guy that Cloud thinks he is for the majority of Final Fantasy VII. And it's an extremely beloved prequel. We got Before Crisis, which is also a prequel that never came out in the United States because it was a feature phone game in Japan, not a smartphone game, not a gacha free-to-play game, a feature phone episodic title that we just never got. Starring the Turks, one of whom, the female Shuriken Turk, is Cisne from Crisis Core. So we got a character from this game, but we did not get the game that she's actually from.
Yay!
Dirge of Cerberus, which is a sequel, I guess, starring Vincent Valentine and a bunch of the other characters from 7. Basically exploring a Shinra conspiracy in Midgar before the place completely collapses. And then we got Advent Children, which is a full-on sequel movie that got the Kingdom Hearts treatment several years later as Advent Children Complete. And it is about basically the disciples of Sephiroth trying to come together to recreate him by making themselves in his image. It's a wild, wild time. And it should be noted that Advent Children came out well before Kingdom Hearts featured the same twist, effectively, where a bunch of the villains were secretly half clones of the one villain.
Yay!
And it also turns out that one of the Sephiroth clones is Cloud.
Yes. I forgot about that.
In a twist that made no sense at the time and heavily factors into Final Fantasy VII Remake.
Yes.
So there's a lot to dig into here. We're going to start with the thing that basically everybody knows, which is children. I mean, sure, but even if you go in chronological order, Crisis Core is so. Crisis Core is like I said, a PSP game starring Zach Fair. It is an action RPG title, and basically it came out, got kind of middling reviews at the time, which, by the way, placed it leagues ahead of Dirge of Cerberus, which got extremely negative reviews at the time.
Which is good bad taste.
I think it's aged a lot better, and it's looked a lot more fondly upon now than it was at the time, because it's got some absurdly strong character writing, and sets up a lot of the less explored elements of the original game very well. Zach is best boy. This I think this is pretty indisputable. He's in the pantheon of best boy.
yeah. This is pretty undisputable at this point. I mean, who is more precious in 7 than Zach?
And he barely appears in the original game, and he is such a beloved character now that he ended up getting a cameo in Kingdom Hearts Birth by Sleep.
Yep. Which makes me wonder, does he also die in the Kingdom Hearts canon?
We don't know. He never shows up again. He's never mentioned. We don't know. We don't know what happened to the boy.
Cloud don't talk about him. Tifa don't talk about him.
So Crisis Core tells the story of Zach, who begins the game as a soldier 3rd class, who's trying to work his way up because he idolizes his hero Sephiroth, who is a 1st class, along with Genesis and Zach's mentor Angeal. 2 of whom are dead by the end of the game. Guess which 2? And actually, no, only one of them, because Genesis survives, and that's a twist that never got delivered upon because
he survived
the series got rebooted
to show up in the secret ending to Dirge of Cerberus.
Yes. The game explores the romance between Zach and Aerith, which is something that plays really heavily into her relationship with Cloud in 7, but you never fully found out the details of until this game. And we also get to see sort of Shinra from the inside for once, where we have a character that very much starts out, on the side of the Empire effectively, and over the course of the game gets very disillusioned with what he's being asked to do. There's a lot of character development. There's a lot of crying. And we find out how Cloud got the Buster Sword. And the whole thing caps off with the very recreation of the beginning of the first game, as a super nice CG cutscene and a to be continued in Final Fantasy VII.
Where you get to re-see that scene in not so great.
Yeah, it looks much worse. And then the other notable thing about this game was the slot machine combat. Which was much maligned at the time. People did not like that. Your character progression and your limit breaks were tied to an in-game, what was perceived to be an RNG. It's not actually RNG because it's not actually random.
Yeah, it's very fun how it's like that. It feels random, but it is very much not.
So
you can abuse it too.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the whole time you're fighting, you have a slot machine in the upper right hand of the screen that is rolling 3 numbers and 3 character portraits. And if the numbers line up or the character portraits line up, then you get a limit break or some kind of stat increase or a level up. The level ups are not actually random. You are gaining experience points. The game just isn't telling you that. But you will eventually level up if you just keep fighting a certain threshold of shadow experience points. It's like effort values in Pokemon. The game doesn't tell you that they exist, but they exist. And it has a way of handing you what you need when you really need it. So what were your guys' initial impressions? Because this is something that I know that all 3 of us have actually experienced. Let's start with Jacob.
In terms of Crisis Core, well, okay, how do I quickly surmise this stuff? Crisis Core is fun. Because it's more structured around the because of its more mission, it's more mission-y style. As someone who was like, so I was super into Kingdom Hearts 358 Days.
Sure, it's very much like that.
And yeah, it's very much like that. So it immediately appealed to me, and Tabata really kicked off his character writing with Crisis Core, I think. So besides, yeah.
Go ahead. Finish.
Oh, I thought you were gonna say. So besides certain obvious strange things like the Gact character and trying to make Sephiroth so super cool, it's really interesting to see how we've got Zack and Jill, as well as like our Hojo knockoff, whose name I've completely forgotten.
I mean, Hojo is also in the game.
Yeah, Hojo is also in the game, but they made a new Hojo character, a slightly less evil Hojo character.
Are you talking about Lizard?
Might be talking about
the director guy.
No, I was going to bring up Lizard, but I forgot everyone's names. I remember the cutscenes.
It's been a while.
Yeah,
it's been a while. It's okay.
Been a minute. I think Lucrezia might make a small appearance in Crisis Core, but
I don't think so. I'm pretty sure.
I don't think she
did. No,
I think she's Dirge only. Otherwise, maybe her name is dropped in like a mission log or something.
Yeah,
because there's all those emails and things that flesh out the internal workings of Shinra itself.
So to kind of explain for those that might have missed this game because it never left the PSP, some of what Jacob was talking about. So the game has a main story. It's not very long, but the game also has hundreds of optional and extremely short and repetitive side quests that you could literally just access from a menu, and they take like 5 minutes. And you get rewards upon rewards upon rewards. This is basically the primary way that you like grind for levels and grind your materia. And it's not as monotonous as it sounds, honestly, because they're so short and you get like a little kickback and maybe a story moment for all of them, including a very fun series of quests where you meet Yuffie, and she is very annoying.
Yuffie is an annoying little shit. I love her.
I know. And then Sephiroth in this time period was like actually like a chaotic good like soldier of justice. This is before he goes crazy prior to the Nibelheim incident in Final Fantasy VII. So he's like actually like a cool, personable dude. Although the game does give you a fun little fake out at the beginning where you beat the first little mini boss in a training simulation. You don't realize it's a training simulation. And suddenly Sephiroth shows up and you think that you're going to have to fight Sephiroth like 10 minutes into the game.
Unfortunately, you don't get to
and
fight him at
like,
all.
Abort mission! Abort mission!
Yeah.
Nate, how about you?
So my initial response to Crest Core was I instantly fell in love with it. Everything was really strong with it. It didn't help. Well, it helped a lot too that I was going through a lot of personal stuff at the time when I was playing it, because I played it definitely after release when I was in the summer of my sophomore year, which if people know me, they know what happened then. And everything about it just struck a chord with me. And even though I knew how it was going to end, you know, I still ended up on a ball on the ground at the end.
Yeah, so the ending of this game will make you ugly cry. Like I've lived with this game for more than a decade now, and just listening to the track that plays over the final cutscene in the credits, like genuinely puts me in a state. And it's a phenomenal track, but like my eyes genuinely start watering as I remember the first time that I heard it, because it's like a sense memory now.
Yeah.
Price of freedom sure is steep.
It's an extremely emotional game. This is and it kind of, you know, speaking of days, because Kingdom Hearts 358 over 2 days has and also like very emotional and foregone ending. You know how both of these games are going to end, but holy crap, it's so sad. And it's like, it's kind of crazy because you can almost forget that the tragedy is coming for a while until, you know, the tone of the story starts getting more and more serious as the body count starts to pile up. It's
fun like that,
heavy. It's a heavy game, but it is also a very joyful one, and it navigates the heft of its plot significantly better than Dirge of Cerberus. That's my transition. Dirge of Cerberus came out on the PS2 and was Square's first attempt at a shooter, an over-the-shoulder shooter.
Yep.
Dear
as
Lord,
was the style at the time.
As was the style at the time. Although I guess this is before third-person shooters really got huge, so it might have been a little ahead of its time. But it was ahead of its time in that really bad way where now we can look at it and be like, wow, this sucked. This sucks to play. It's not fun.
I still enjoy its terribleness in some way, but it's possibly nostalgia.
So Dirge of Cerberus is the so bad it's good entry in this series for shoresies. The plot is B movie schlock, absolutely. It's so fucking contrived and convoluted.
The evil secret military organization experiment that was always happening in the background and that had never been touched upon once, but was always definitely there.
Yeah. So so my experience with that whole thing made me feel kind of the same way that I felt watching Star Wars Clone Wars and watching the character of Ahsoka Tano, who is one of my favorite Star Wars characters ever. But like watching through all of Clone Wars, it's really weird that they never bring her up, considering how important she is, you know, in the actual movies of the franchise. And a lot of this stuff in Dirge of Cerberus feels that way. Like, wow, we weren't talking about this before. That seems kind of strange. And thankfully, this is something that does get rectified in Final Fantasy VII Remake. Especially if you play the intermission chapter, but it's goofy. It's very goofy. It's Square Enix's Shadow the Hedgehog for sure.
Oh god, another one of my nostalgic games.
Okay, so we already heard about Pyra's experience with this game. Nate, have you played Dirge of Cerberus?
I have. I've played up until you meet Cloud for the first time, and I think Genesis shows up in like the warehouse. So this is pretty early on in the game. I think this is within the first hour to 2 hours.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a question?
Genesis does not show up until the secret ending.
Really? Because I could have sworn there's a scene
I don't think Cloud even appears until he's in that one cutscene, like 70% of the way through, where they can go, look, the rest of Final Fantasy VII is just over there.
Are you sure
Vincent isn't involved with them.
It's happening off screen.
Everything else is happening over there. You get the one cool cinematic, and then Vincent goes off by himself.
I'm gonna say, because like I could have sworn that you see them during the town mission, because you go into like a lab, you see Cloud and everybody for like a couple seconds, and then Vincent pieces out. And it's just like a quick talk, like Vincent gives them like a quick, hey, this is what's going on, guys, and then goes away.
Yeah. Because there's a part with Reeve and Yuffie early on, but you don't really see anyone for like more than a second or two at best.
Yeah.
Besides Reeve.
See, and I think this perfectly sums up my experience with Dirge of Cerberus. I have a lot of half-remembered memories with this game, apparently. And not for lack of trying, it just didn't hit me in the PS2 era, mostly because I was also a GameCube boy.
I rented the game out from Video Easy, which I don't know if you have it, but that's a Blockbuster equivalent.
Australia.
Yeah. So Hollywood Video equivalent for those.
And Dirge of Cerberus Dirge of Cerberus had this really fun system of, it is completely impossible to grind in this game.
Yes. Yep.
Making it entirely possible for you to completely screw yourself over by increasing or boosting the wrong kind of weapon or the wrong kind of materia, leaving you with a really annoying boss where you need to explode barrels of fire spells, but you've been boosting Blizzard because you found it useful for the last 3 chapters.
Yup. It's a bad game. It's a bad game. It's not.
Or if you want to get like the ultimate weapon, you need to pick up a toy gun and take up one of your precious slots early on in like the second mission, and then boost it to its maximum. In a game that's already like, how about we make it nearly impossible for you to win early stages with that precise moves?
This game melts my brain.
It's really funny. It hits the point where they start putting vending machine shops in the middle of boss fights.
I'm genuinely tearing up, getting upset about this.
Okay.
about the way that this game fucking functions because they did not know what they were doing.
You can just, in the middle of a boss fight, walk over to a vending machine, buy some potions because you don't have enough slots, but you've got a bit of cash.
Does anybody have any closing thoughts on Dirge of Cerberus before we move on for all of our sakes?
Vincent is very angry because he got cucked.
He got cucked by...
by Hojo.
Okay, we can make this sentence worse. He got cucked by a dog.
Yeah.
Why the fuck is that the law?
Okay, but in fairness, this was before Final Fantasy VII Remake came out and everyone wanted to fuck Red 13.
Yeah, but what is Hojo's obsession with? We're gonna put him in a big cell, we're gonna watch him fuck. And everyone's like, Hojo, what's that for? I'm just really into it.
Hell.
Okay. I'm gonna move on. I'm gonna move on
for the best.
I'm gonna move on to so
and we know Hojo has a bestiality fetish, and that's
we
all
knew
we
that
need
already.
to know.
We've been known. We've been known.
We've been known.
We put him in a cell to watch him fucking.
I'll get into it when we get to the Final Fantasy VII remake episode, but I was so afraid for that scene in the remake. I was so afraid.
So Advent Children. We're moving on. So Advent Children. The plot of Advent Children is, so at the end of Final Fantasy VII, the life stream pours all over the planet because it's like it's healed now. We've defeated the great evil.
Yeah.
And it turns out in Advent Children that the life stream also was carrying the fucking plague.
Yeah, and it gave people cancer.
Yes.
Stone cancer.
So this movie, in this movie again, so it turns out that the plague, which is Sephiroth's genetic code, has swept throughout the world. That is what geostigma is. I'm going to spoil this whole movie because, if you're not super into it, it's not worth watching.
It's more of an action. It's more of an action film anyway, and they just make a really good plot excuse for Cloud to get broody and edgy. How people seem to think he was.
Yes.
And then they gave it a genuine reason for him to be like that.
So Advent Children is a series of batshit insane excuse plots that go in between insane action sequences. It's a lot, and I will admit that all the fights look real cool, but
it was there so we could make AMVs of Zack and Cloud.
Yes, absolutely. This is the other brain melting Final Fantasy VII spinoff because it's just so dumb, and a lot of people love it anyway because it looks so good. This was the second attempt by Square to make a movie after the abject and utter failure of Final Fantasy: The Spirits Within, a movie starring Mulan that had nothing to do with Final Fantasy but cost way too much goddamn money to make. And it's much better. It's still better than Spirits Within because Spirits Within is incomprehensible.
It's not a high bar. The bar is quite literally on the floor.
Yes.
I think they might have forgotten to put the bar there in the first place.
But and we see Rufus again in a thing no one was asking for, and he's also got Sephiroth plague.
Rufus has a really cool scene too, because why not?
Yeah.
If you can't, I say this as someone that's incapable of turning his brain off. I think that I shouldn't have to. This is a movie that if you can turn your brain off, it's going to be a much smoother experience.
Don't worry, I failed to turn my brain off and I still had a good time because it's just kind of a mess. But like,
yes.
My
also, I hadn't played the original Final Fantasy.
Yeah, my boyfriend watched
So-
Advent Children without ever having touched any other piece of Final Fantasy VII media outside of Kingdom Hearts 1 and 2. So he had a good time, but it's, you don't like if you have any idea of like what you should be expecting going into this movie aside from really good looking action sequences, I'm really sorry.
You get new outfits for everybody, which is cool.
Yeah.
The three mini sets are cool.
But
they all fuse to make a new set.
They do. And remember, they are going to be very important in Remake.
So,
they do the whole. This is a Cloud's fun fight.
So Nate, I'm going to trust you to include a timestamp here. We don't have a whole lot of qualms about spoiling Final Fantasy VII Remake, but just in case you haven't played it and don't know what the nature of Final Fantasy VII Remake is yet at this point in time, by the time we get to making an episode about it, there will be no spoiler warnings. It will be even older than it is now. But
Yeah.
If you don't want to be spoiled, go to the timestamp that's going to be in the description and in the episode notes. This is your warning. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go.
Flash.
So obviously the most important part of Advent Children is that 7 Remake is a direct sequel to it.
Yep.
Because Sephiroth from the end of Advent Children travels back in time to be the Sephiroth of Final Fantasy VII Remake.
And technically so does Aerith.
Yes. So
I prefer to read that as like something live stream visions determinism.
I guess so, but like Sephiroth explicitly has his memories. Aerith has vibes. Aerith has bad vibes.
Well, there's a lot of bad
vibes are rancid for Aerith.
But near the end of Remake, when she turns around and talks about how she was always afraid of the sky, it gives off the feeling that she definitely has some sort of memory. And there are different theories about this right now. One is that she's actually put herself into a time loop of up until she dies over and over repeatedly.
Yes.
The other I want to say is that she wasn't able to make the full jump like Sephiroth was, and instead sent partial memories over to her past self, which
Rancid
also
vibes.
which it would help with how dramatically different Aerith is in Remake to 7. Besides, better writing for Aerith.
Yes, and a correct name.
Yeah.
But I have been happy so far with the way that they have started to integrate everything from the compilation into Remake, because it feels much more graceful. It's goofy, but like the compilation plot was always goofy, so at least it's goofy and it's being integrated in at the proper time, as opposed to being staple gunned on after the fact.
The secret organization that always definitely existed. Deep ground. Under.
Yeah. Play Intermission. If you have not yet, play Intermission. It's worth it. Don't let Bailey tell you otherwise. he's just bitter and jaded. Okay. Spoiler time. Spoiler time over. So for those of you who did not get to experience the compilation, unfortunately, none of it except for Advent Children is ever going to actually see the light of day again. We're not really expecting, as much as people want it, any sort of HD re-release for either Dirge or Crisis Core, and unfortunately that is because of one of the voice actors. I have mad respect for Gact, but basically they would have to pay him a bunch of money to reuse his performance as Genesis, and they're not going to do it.
I think they should release Dirge of Cerberus, but they shouldn't change a single thing except just cut the secret movie, and it should be in its just standard definition. The only way to.
The thing about that is that I don't think that would work particularly well, because Dirge of Cerberus in a vacuum is just terrible nonsense.
That's exactly it. No re-release, cut the secret ending.
But all of it is being readapted into a new mobile game that will be coming supposedly this year, called Final Fantasy VII Ever Crisis. It is going to be a free-to-play gachapon game, but from what I can tell, it looks like it is just going to be a weapon gachapon game, so all of the characters will more than likely be unlocked just through playing the game. Like, especially, I can't imagine doing a character gacha for this because you have a limited pool of characters. You can't just make more. But I'm looking forward to it, if only because this is going to be the first time we're officially getting Before Crisis in any form. So there's a whole side of this story that American audiences, even if they paid really close attention, aren't familiar with. In terms of the legacy of Final Fantasy VII itself, there are also 2 novellas, one of which I have on a shelf behind me.
Oh, hello.
There is a sequel anthology series, basically, that follows a couple of individual character stories, and then there is specifically a novella about the Turks called The Kids Are All Right, which I own. It was officially released in English a couple years ago. I believe the other one was as well. On the Way to a Smile, if I remember the name correctly.
Well, I was in the film. Well, On the Way onto the Smile. Okay, yeah, you're right. On the Way to the Smile, and there's also On the Way to the Smile episode Denzel, which is an OVA based off that book.
In terms of the compilation, there's also an anime short that basically adapts the end of Crisis Core called Last Crisis. It's really hard to find unless you go, yo-ho-hoing, sailing the high seas. It's out there, but it's not legally out there, unfortunately. But it's quite good, and it's very short. I believe it's only about a half an hour long. And obviously now we have Remake sort of continuing the legacy in a more direct way. My thoughts on the legacy of 7 itself, in terms of how it affected other Final Fantasy games, I think it influenced the setting of 8 at least a little bit, but the game in which I think you can most obviously see its influence is 13. And that's not super controversial. People were making fun of Lightning and calling her female Cloud for a while.
Which is funny because doing that misses Cloud's character completely.
And Lightning's, but you don't find out a whole lot about her till the latter couple of games. So
I was gonna say it's like 13.3, right? Is where she gets like her real backstory.
Hello? What?
What?
Oh, just I didn't. That would require me to actually go and want to actually play 13.3.
It's good. I promise. It just needs a re-release to be on platforms that can actually run it.
It's on PC, isn't it?
It's on PC, but it's not a very good port. I believe that it's still capped at 30 frames per second.
It's fine.
Yeah.
And I believe it's also still capped at 1080p, or not at 720p. Excuse me.
Oh, I don't care about that. It's the re-release of 13 isn't stable. So if it's anything like the release, this is of 13 and 13.2, then it will barely run in the first place.
Yeah, I would buy that. Or I guess I wouldn't. But do you guys have any closing thoughts on the compilation?
Compilation is all right in its entirety. There's good times to be had. There's also bad times to be had.
The kids are all right.
There you go.
The kids are all right, and we're getting even more all right kids in the near future, hopefully. How about you? Or was that your snappy one line?
So that was snappy because I don't have anything. I don't have anything else. FF7 left it left a legacy of fans who wanted more of the previous but looking better because it came at that one split at PS1. So but
thankfully with 7 we have you know a lot more to look forward to in the future. But we're going to be talking about the way that it influenced every later game in the series as we continue through Final Fantasy. And we don't know when the next episode is going to be, but it's going to be about 8 and 9. And it's going to be an episode in which I'm very heavily personally biased. I'm gonna say that ahead of time. But in the meantime, I want to thank you guys for listening to another episode of the Stray Pixels podcast. We post every Tuesday on your podcast app of choice and also on the Noisy Pixel YouTube channel. What do you guys remember most about Final Fantasy VII? Is there anything that you wanted to get out of it that you didn't? Is there anything you're really looking forward to in either the second parts of the remake or in Ever Crisis when it eventually comes out? Let us know in the comments. If there's anything you'd like us to talk about on a future episode, you can leave a comment under this video, or you can talk to us on Twitter. You can find me, Colin, at the Arcane Ranger. You can find Nate at Less Than Nathan, and you can find Jacob at Pyreloop, or the site itself at Noisy Pixel News. The Stray Pixels podcast is brought to you by NoisyPixel.net. Noisy Pixel is run by a group of gamers who work hard to bring you the latest news, reviews, previews, podcasts, and more. Please like, subscribe, and follow, and join our Discord server to keep up with our future content, and we will see you guys next week.
See ya.